In the 2000s, Halo and horror were an incredibly iconic duo, even more iconic than Me and the Flood. Well, kind of. Halo and its horror roots have become a rather hot talking point in recent years, and although the trilogy definitely has its fair share of horror moments, they weren't exclusively horror games like, say, Resident Evil for example. However, today, I want to go over some stories in Halo's lore that are exclusively horror stories, both intentionally and unintentionally. Now, you're probably thinking that this is just going to be yet another HiddenXperia Flood video, and although you aren't entirely wrong, there is one story in here that isn't even slightly Flood related that honestly nobody really talks about that I guarantee will make you look at a certain species in a radically different way. But in true HiddenXperia fashion, we are of course going to start out with a Flood story, one of the two that I've actually never covered before. This story is simply titled Hunger. It's a short, or well, very short story actually, from the 2010 re-release of The Flood that's told from the perspective of an infection form and also its host, both before, during, and then also after the excruciating process of infection. Now, because of the state of its protagonist, the story is told in a very incoherent manner. The infection form, as expected, has very limited and very primitive thoughts, but when the infection begins and the perspective shifts to the man being infected, who, mind you, is one of Johnson's men, it gets a little bit more coherent, albeit still very disjointed, because of the extreme physical and mental pain that he's experiencing, as the infection form snaps and breaks his bones, necrotizes and consumes his flesh from the inside, and steals control of his body and his most precious thoughts, all while he's still alive. Now, I could explain the entire story to you like this, but frankly, I don't think it'd do it justice. This story, it's just much easier if I read it to you. So, here we go.
Sound. Cold. Hunger. Hunger. Sound. Motion. Cold. Motion. Hunger. Barrier. Hunger. Light. Sound. Hunger. Warmth. Freedom. Hunger. Searching. Searching. Hunger. Warmth. Sound. Fear. Surging. Jump. Texture. Wet. Sound. Other. Food? Not food. Hunger. Sound. Hunger. Searching. Searching. Pain. Sound. Searching. Hunger. Sound. Searching. Jump. Food. Feast. Burrow. Feast. Become. Become. Become.
Make it stop. Jesus, God, get it off of me.
Become. Spine. Pierce. Change. Feast. Grow. Food. Many food. Become.
Birthday. Love. Oh God, it hurts. The first time I met her. Where's Johnson? Oh God, it hurts. It hurts.
Become. Break. Feast. Tear. Knit. Borrow. Become.
Boot camp. What's your name? Anna. Birthday. It's tearing me apart. Where's Johnson? Kill me, please, God.
Become. Seize. Sight. Smell. Pain. Decay. Move. Anna. Stand. Food. Create. Become.
So hungry. Can't look. Son's birthday tomorrow. Pain. Me. I'm not me. Slipping. Son. Pistol. End it. Son.
Become. Weapon. Steel. Hand. Others becoming. Son. Paw. Move. Shoot. Hunger. Become.
Hungry. Others together. No, don't touch him. Me. Paul. Run. Together. Last target down. Success. Together.
Become. Others becoming. Others here. Many. covenant, autumn, food, many, freedom, autumn, ship, become.
Hungry, pillar of autumn. Paul, no, don't. Hungry, Anna, food, survivors, nearby. Engineering is on level 4. Hungry.
Become. Ship. Freedom. Food. Paul. Anna. Food. Become.
Hungry. Oh God, Paul. I'm so sorry. No end. Food. Freedom. Reach. Hungry.
Become. Freedom. Food. Together. Become.
Food. Paul.
Become. Become.
Forgive me.
Become. Become. Become.
So, the mixture of the excruciating physical pain that the Marine goes through and the immense psychological pain as well of the memories of his family and his son are a pretty hard combo. I mean, he can't even log out, so to speak, either, because right as he's about to, the infection form takes control again and stops him from doing it. And it even goes as far as injecting his wife and son's memories into the Flood hive mind as well, with likely the intent one day of twisting and contorting them the same way that it has done to him. I mean, it even refers to them as food. Truly horrifying. If you ask me, that's kind of on par with the Jenkins infection, quite honestly. Next up, we have a story with no actual name. It's one that's just referred to by its in-universe designation. Entry 47-2396/10763. A highly redacted Oni analysis of a priority distress call from a UNSC private whose entire squad had been consumed by the Flood. These logs, again, come courtesy of the re-release of the Flood, and as such, they take place on Alpha Halo during the Flood outbreak. Now, given that this was the first outbreak that could be actually relayed back to Oni High Command, it was also their first ever encounter with the parasite as well. The private, whose name and designation were redacted, landed with his squad in their life pod from the autumn right into the heart of the Alpha Halo outbreak. He has no idea where they landed, and all his squad mates have been consumed by these strange creatures that he knows are not the Covenant. As the last survivor, he's trapped inside the life pod, where he sends this frantic distress call. He exclaims that his team are dead, or worse, constantly interrupting himself, panicking that the distress call isn't actually sending. Perpetually short on breath, his statements are short. He begs for somebody, for anybody to pick up, and for someone to come and help. In his hysteria, he says that everybody from the autumn is gone. He doesn't think that anyone else is alive, that these things he's encountered are worse than the Covenant, before again panicking about the message not being received. He once again states that these creatures are unlike anything that they've ever encountered. They're everywhere, and they don't stop. He then begins to sob uncontrollably, and the desperation kicks in. Speaking into the life pod's microphone, he begs to go home. He doesn't want to be here anymore. He just wants to go home. He just wants someone, anyone, to reply to him and say something. There's then a new sound that the mic picks up on the life pod's exterior, increasing in decibels. The subject is not alone. He too then picks up on the sounds outside and declares that they are coming. They're like giant roaches, like monsters that he can't fight. His sobbing gets louder and more frantic as he realizes that nobody's there. There's no one on the other end of the distress call. Nobody's listening to him. There's nobody coming to save him. He confesses how scared he is, how much he just wants to go home, but nobody's getting the distress call because, as far as he knows, there's nobody left to get it. Everyone's gone. It's just him. Just him and them. He's all alone. The exterior sounds continue. He says that he can hear them, like they're scratching on his brain. The way they move and what they do, they don't just kill you, they change you. They're here. To anyone who gets this message, to anyone out there who might see it or hear it, he says that he's sorry. And then, a single M6C Magnum shot is heard. and the audio transcript ends. So this is another short one, but it's a prime example of the extreme psychological distress and anguish that the mere presence of the Flood inflict on potential hosts, especially those who have no idea what they actually are. The Flood are a terrifying entity either way, but to be entirely ignorant about their existence and suddenly get jumped by them, watch your entire squad get infected and turn, and then be hunkered down in this tiny claustrophobic life pod all alone with nobody coming to save you as they get closer and closer, is a level of terrifying that not many other Flood interactions yield. This story, and also Hunger, are two extremely underrated Flood stories that nobody talks about, likely because of the rather obscure niche release of the book that they're tied to, but they deserve a lot more praise than they get. So, if all this Flood talk is giving you a hankering for some Flood slaying, my Flood-themed PCs that are made in partnership with Apex Gaming PCs are the way to go. From the Pure Form to the Gravemind and the Primordial build, there's a PC build here for every level of PC gamer, fit perfectly for all of your Flood slaying needs. Just hit the link in the description and pick one of these bad boys up today. Okay, frankly, I think it might be illegal in like 57 states for me to talk about Halo horror stories and not mention the Mona Lisa. Now, frankly, I talk about Mona Lisa more than I talk about my own family nowadays, right? But there's a reason for that. It's just such a great example of the kind of clandestine horror aspects of Oni lore and the zombie body horror aspects of Flood lore combining to just create something truly special. So, when Oni were debriefed about the Flood after the outbreak on Alpha Halo, where most would be horrified, terrified about the existence of this literal zombie parasite, Oni saw potential. So, when the Mona Lisa, a freighter ship turned prison ship, took an infected Covenant as a prisoner, Oni suddenly became very interested, taking command of the ship and converting it once more into a human Flood experimentation lab. Their intent was to experiment on the Mona Lisa's human and also elite prisoners with the Flood, with the hope of understanding and eventually weaponizing it, turning the parasite into their very own bioweapon that they could use to destroy the Covenant, and also anybody or anything else that posed a threat. Only Major John Smith, who was an agent with a suspiciously ambiguous name, was given command of the Mona Lisa and also all of the horrific experiments that would be carried out on it, until there was a containment breach and also a prison riot that sent the ship into anarchy. As expected, almost all of the prisoners were infected by the Flood, and the basis of a proto-Gravemind was also very quickly formed. After the ship went dark, Oni dispatched a group of Marines to Alpha Halo's debris field on a higher-than-top-secret mission to recover an ancient alien artifact, or so they were told. At no point were they informed of the Flood's existence. After scanning the debris field for days, they finally discovered an escape pod with a severely mutilated human prisoner inside, who alluded to horrific things happening aboard the ship before succumbing to his wounds, if you can say that. So the Marines set out for the Mona Lisa. Aboard, they found Agent Smith, who eventually slipped from their grasp and escaped back to the prowler that they arrived on. One by one, the Marines would succumb to the outbreak aboard the ship, with infected numbers proving far too great for any number of Marines to handle. It was clear that there was no containing this outbreak from within, so the few remaining survivors retreated to the escape pods, only to find that 2 remained. Finding the perfect moment, one of the Marines, McCraw, took the coward's way out and stole one of the escape pods for himself, leaving only 2 survivors, the Marines' leader, Sergeant Lopez, and the friendly cricket bat-wielding elite prisoner, Henry. As the story ends, the 2 engage in a CQC fight that would make the boss proud for the final escape pod, but we never find out who wins. At least, we never do in the story. Later on, we kind of did. Before leaving the area, the Red Horse, the prowler that they came in on, destroyed the Mona Lisa with Shiva-class nuclear warheads, neutralizing the Proto-Gravemind and all Flood on board. Section 3 agent John Smith was never heard from again. He likely just assumed a different identity and continued his research elsewhere, shielded by the immense political power of the office. McCraw was also never heard from again, but whether he actually managed to survive the blast of the warheads is doubtful. When the Red Horse returned to human space, neither Lopez nor Henry were listed on its records, which implies that both were killed in the ship's destruction, but I mean, who knows? Maybe one of them is still out there right now. Personally, I kinda hope Henry survived. The guy had clearly watched Shaun of the Dead. I mean, he was killing zombies with a cricket bat, right? The guy was obviously a Shaun of the Dead fan, and he's an elite. How can I not love him? Either way though, the Mona Lisa is an insight into the most horrifying acts that government bodies carry out in the name of victory that we never hear about. Attempting to create a bioweapon with the Flood via human experimentation is arguably the greatest war crime in galactic history, and you know for a fact that if they'd pulled it off and used it to defeat the Covenant, they wouldn't have just stopped using it there. Given how controlling and oppressive the UEG are known to be, you know for a goddamn fact that eventually dissenting outer colonies full of insurrectionists would end up getting a dose of the ancient corrupted god dust bioweapon as soon as they started acting up. But the real question is, did Oni's experiments with the Flood stop with the Mona Lisa? I'd hazard a guess that they didn't. Okay, talking about Oni, let's flip the coin now for once and talk about a story in which the humanity-destroying crimes against nature are actually committed against them. Stomping on the Heels of a Fuss. Stomping on the Heels of a Fuss is the only story in Halo lore that truly exposes the violent brutality of the Brutes, and it does so in excruciating detail, far surpassing anything from the games, even going as far as making Halo 2's depiction of the Brutes look like a fairy tale. The story follows Oni linguistic researcher Connor Brian, who gets captured by a small pack of Brutes hunting on the quiet human colony of Beta Gabriel. Connor gets held captive with a few other very unlucky survivors in the Brute's makeshift camp, and he's witness to some of the most deplorable stomach-churning atrocities that a man could ever experience. You know, this entire movie really feels like it was written and directed by Eli Roth. In fact, there are even some parts in it that kind of outdo some of the soul-crushing, hollowing things that he puts in these movies. In his research, Connor had studied cannibals, but cannibals, he said, always had a doctrine. The Brutes that he was now held captive by in what is described as a human pen had no discernible doctrine. The Brutes' camp was beside their ship, next to a forest, and among some of the colony's shops that had all been ransacked. The ground was strewn with thousands of human bones, all still covered in dried blood with some muscle clinging to them. There were even methane tanks and the charred remains of grunts as well. These beasts had even resorted to eating their own. Human remains lined the forest pathways, beaten to pulpy pieces surrounding the camp. Some corpses and remains even hung from trees. It was clear that the Brutes had no respect for humans whatsoever, nor any care for the vile stench that the rotting corpses and discarded flesh among the camp were creating. But their behaviour was even more vile, and it paints the Brutes in an even more terrifying light than anything before. All the human prisoners had to keep their eyes sternly fixed to the ground, because making even the slightest eye contact with a Brute was typically a death sentence. In his research, Connor had watched video feeds of humans defiantly staring Brutes in the eyes, only to then be beaten to a mush in seconds. Within the pen, the Brutes had turned the human captives into toys. They were tortured in despicable ways, pitted against one another in games that even Connor couldn't discern the rules of. At one point, he even speculated that before he was captured, they'd been feeding their prisoners human flesh, forced cannibalization for their captives that they held even less respect for than dirt. And then the pen itself was foul. Shreds of soiled clothing hung in tatters from the captive humans, all starved and deprived of water, growing unhealthily thin, fading away, and going hollow. Their hair was knotted on their heads and their faces, their hands and teeth were bloodstained, and they were covered in unhealed scars, open wounds, and mounds of excrement. When one of them was let out, the Brute's plan to hunt him was cut short. The man, a rich, famous, and fat big game hunter by the name of Haig, was ripped off his feet by one of the Brutes who hung him upside down by one leg. Another Brute then came and grabbed the other leg, and the two pulled this man apart by his legs, crunches and screams from the man tearing through the eardrums of the rest of the captives who couldn't drown it out, all while the Brutes laughed. When the chieftain arrived, he lifted the remains of Haig up, his torso with just a string of muscle loosely connecting the head and nothing else. The man had quite literally been pulled apart limb from limb. Later in the story, when the captives stage an escape, one of them gets caught, a previously rich, beautiful woman by the name of Nyxeles, who was now gaunt and hollow. When she was caught trying to get revenge on her captors with a spiker, a brute quite literally smacked her head clean from her shoulders. Others that fled were caught and ripped to shreds on the spot, their flesh torn into by the brute's teeth. And they kept that same level of savagery for their own as well. In a prior altercation, when Connor had led an expedition into Covenant space, they'd captured some brutes, and when one of them wouldn't fight back against their human captors, the entire pack turned on him and tore him to shreds in an act of murderous rampage. And in fact, it was this savagery for their own that Oni had hopes of weaponizing to try and sow dissent within the Covenant, which in fact was why Connor was sent to Beta Gabriel in the first place. This plan, however, was ultimately unsuccessful. When the chieftain of the pack was challenged, the battle only lasted a few minutes. The challenger had his neck viciously stamped on, crushing it at the shoulder blade, and then just to rub it in, the chieftain knelt down and violently bit into his broken neck and ripped his throat out with his teeth. But as violent as that is, the brute's affinity for eating human flesh, especially before their human captives, is probably the most unsettling part of this story, at least to me. Cannibalism is one of those things that's always deeply unsettled me. I mean, obviously it's going to, but really more than any other kind of horror. And any movie that involves it kind of just makes me feel like mentally sick and a little bit unwell, which I guess is a good thing, right? If it was the opposite way around, I'd start to get a little bit concerned about myself, but the fact that it makes me feel that way is probably a good thing. And although what we're talking about here isn't entirely cannibalism, the way that the brutes go about eating humans and the way that it's described really invokes that just horrific, unsettling feeling. The brutes love to watch humans suffer almost as much as eating them. Their flesh was truly special. During hunts where they'd let a human go so that they could catch them and then consume them, they'd forego weapons simply because they enjoyed killing by hand more than using any kind of tool or implement. This pack in particular saw human flesh as an offering from the gods. In fact, one of them, Gallubus, had actually come close to making the fatter humans that they ate taste like Thornbeast, which was a delicacy that they enjoyed on their native moon of Tish. They made a point of eating human flesh right in front of their human captives, which just further chipped away at what little hope and humanity they had left. Honestly, the more I talk about the story and when I read through it again for this video, it really felt like the kind of story that Eli Roth would write if he was given the keys to Halo. And you know what? There are many directors and writers that I'd like to have the keys to Halo. I kind of hope that Eli Roth isn't one of them, because seeing this on the screen, as cool as it would be in concept, would be like deeply unsettling. As for the story itself, well, I wanted to focus mostly on the depravity and the vileness of the brutes here, but long story short, the brutes break out into a pack versus pack fight, which allows the humans to escape. In the end, only two of them make it, Connor and a man by the name of Dask Jevadim, who might sound familiar. He's the leader of the Triad cult from Hunt the Truth and also from the brute story that we got a few months ago from on Halo Waypoint. And then right before the two make their eventual escape, when the escape shuttle arrives, Dask betrays Connor by executing him with his own magnum and then flees so Oni can't capture him. It's a rather horrific end to Connor's story, but I mean, it's not even close to the harrowing experience that they both suffered through in a brute-run prisoner camp. Maybe now you understand why that Marine in Halo 3 soiled himself when the brutes got a hold of him. Rather bleak. And finally, we have one of my favourite short stories in the entirety of Halo lore that is extremely harrowing, but in a rather different and unique way. Soma the Painter. Now for this one, you need a little bit of backstory. When the Flood first emerged in ancient human space, their rapid consumption quickly drove the humans back into Foreigner-controlled space, which the Foreigners deemed an act of war. This led to them wiping their human rivals out once and for all and resetting them back to the Stone Age. But mysteriously at the same time, the parasite seemed to recede as well, almost in an act of defeat. Rumour quickly spread throughout the foreigner ecumene that the humans had found a miracle cure. Others believed that they'd found not a cure, but an antidote, so to speak. They genetically modified 1/3 of their entire species population to destroy the flood, and then sacrificed that third of their population to the parasite, which in turn destroyed them. However, there were many who doubted these claims and rumours, and so, despite the flood vanishing, they remained steadfast in their research for some kind of counter, or a vaccine, or an antidote, or a cure. But for 8,500 years, the flood were never seen, or encountered, or even heard of. That was until one horrifyingly fateful day on the serene, distant planet of Seaward. Seaward was a retreat planet for wealthy foreigners who wished to shed their armour, their personal AIs, and all of their hyper-advanced technology for a more simple life. One that allowed them to reconnect with the nature that their species' advancement had forsaken. It was in fact home to roughly 1 million who chose this primitive path. Designated G617G1, the planet itself was located right on the edge of both foreigner space and the galaxy itself, far from the centre of the ecumene and really any other planets in general. Every now and then, resupply balloons would come to drop supplies off for the colony, but for all intents and purposes, they were almost entirely disconnected in every way from the rest of the ecumene, as was the intention of its inhabitants. In 97,764 BC, Seaward inhabitant Soma left her small bustling town of Wharftown to capture something truly unique. Soma was a painter, and was attempting to capture the moment two fire began in the sky. Now, two fire was an optical effect that was caused by the light from Seaward's two suns passing under the horizon and reflecting off the scattered clouds above. She painted onto a glass easel using a jet brush, which was a foreigner kind of paintbrush that sprayed smart pigments onto the glass automatically. Basically, it painted whatever she saw. To capture such an extraordinary occurrence, Soma had ascended to a hill above Wharftown, from which she had a perfect view of the azure expanse of the sea and the distant white-capped mountains beyond the reef that had now picked up motes of pink. Seaward was a truly beautiful little world, ideal for foreigners who wished to forsake their overbearing technology and live a simpler, more peaceful, quiet life. Its existence was funded by the art and energy that those elite few who called it home created, and those further into the heart of the galaxy who purchased from Seaward's elite made a conscious effort to keep its existence a secret. To 99.9% of the foreigner population, Seaward didn't exist. As the planet's two suns moved closer together, the motors in Soma's jet brush began to spool up. The two fire lit up the sky, reflecting perfectly off the clouds, turning them pink, then crimson, then green, then blue, before fading back to pink. The two fire's majesty caused Soma's eyes to well up with tears, and after wiping them, she glanced down at her easel. The rainbow array of lights had been captured perfectly on the skyscape that she'd already painted, and she thought to herself, wonderful. Until she took a closer look at the pattern, and her amazement turned to confusion. It looked as though the jet brush had malfunctioned. There was a strange flaw at the heart of Two Fire's light, a dark grey streak, a dirty charcoal imperfection drawn through the centre of the other hues in a floundering arc, trailing a sickly yellow smoke behind it. The smear looked ominous, and as Soma gave the sky above her a quick momentary glance, fear set in. That same imperfection hung there in the pink sky, very real, baleful, moving steadily and purposefully toward the horizon. Something was coming. Something was wrong. She hastily folded her easel, packed her jet brush and belongings up, and hurried back down the hill to Wharftown. This day in 97,764 BC marked the flood's final return to the galaxy, and Seaward was its first target. Now earlier I mentioned that Seaward was designated Colony G617. Well, in the book of Genesis, passage 617, it reads, "For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die." And so, those are 5 stories in Halo lore that I think are genuinely, legitimately scary in a number of different kind of ways. You've got stories like the Mona Lisa that are, pretty typical zombie horror, then Stomping on the heels of a first that really dives into the very unsettling horror of the brutes that the games just don't touch on, and then others like Soma the Painter venture more into existential horror, which I think is actually a very underrated kind of subgenre of horror, and so on. Halo is packed full of amazing horror stories, and I just really hope that one day, hopefully fingers crossed soon, the main games return to having horror as a key element of their kind of atmosphere and emotional invoking, if that's even the right way to put it. Either way, let me know your favorite, and if you think that I've missed any other horror stories that I could have talked about in this video, let me know down below in the comments. And with that said, I'm going to round this video out there. I want to give a huge thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there as per usual. Thank you all so much, and thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll catch you all in the next one.